Feeding animals today is a costly endeavor, but things were a little different back in the Middle Ages. Back then, peasants didn't need to rush out to the store or spend coins on animal feed. They used whatever was around them, often for free. There were no online orders or bags of pellets in sight. Instead, they worked with nature to keep their animals fed without parting with any money. Here's how they pulled off feeding their animals without breaking the bank in medieval times. In the medieval world, feeding animals didn't mean running out to the pet store to grab some kibble. The peasants had perfected the art of working with the land. One of their main resources was the forest, which provided an abundance of free food. Pigs, in particular, were the ultimate foragers. When autumn rolled around, these snuffling creatures would be let loose in the woods to feast on fallen nuts, a practice called pennage. This method of fattening pigs on forest nuts, acorns, chestnuts, and beechnuts, was a well-established medieval tradition. It worked because one mature oak tree could drop up to 700 pounds of acorns in a good year. That's plenty to fatten up several pigs for weeks without the peasants having to lift a finger. In fact, the forest was so important for feeding pigs that some medieval communities had specific areas designated as pigwoods. These forests were managed specifically to maximize nut production, ensuring that the pigs had enough to eat during the autumn months. One historical record from an English manor shows that they valued their oak forests more for feeding pigs than for timber. They calculated that 50 mature oak trees could fatten 30 pigs from September to November without needing any additional feed. Goats, too, got in on the forest feast, but they were a bit more selective about what they ate. While pigs rooted around in the forest floor, goats used their climbing abilities to reach for tender young shoots and tree bark. Their flexible upper lips allowed them to pick the perfect bits of growth even in the most difficult spots, often stripping ivy and nibbling on the leaves. Goats were valuable because they could also digest plants that were toxic to other livestock, such as hemlock, which would have killed a cow. These little walking garbage disposals could turn poisonous plants into milk, proof that even back then there was such a thing as a free lunch. While pigs and goats roamed the woods eating acorns and leaves, other livestock, like cows and sheep, preferred the forest edges where the grass was plentiful. These animals would graze on wild varieties of clover, fescue, and meadow grasses, the same types you might find in modern lawns today. Interestingly, the act of grazing in these areas helped maintain the clearing and prevent the forest from becoming overgrown. In fact, this type of grazing created the patchwork landscapes we see in parts of Europe today. Cows in particular could eat an astonishing amount of vegetation, up to 100 pounds of fresh plants a day. And what's even better is that the peasants didn't need to grow that food themselves. They didn't need to water it, harvest it, or pay for it. It was all there, free for the taking. Geese, too, played their part. They were the wetland specialists, feeding on seeds, aquatic plants, and small creatures found in streams and marshes. Their wide bills made them perfect for sifting through mud, rooting out hidden treasures like roots and invertebrates. A flock of geese could easily police an area for fallen seeds and berries, and the peasants didn't have to do much except point them in the right direction. It was like having their own team of natural lawnmowers, only with a bit of an attitude problem. Remarkably, this whole system was sustainable. The animals didn't deplete the forest because they were part of the natural cycle. They spread seeds through their droppings, pruned vegetation, and fertilized the soil, all while turning inedible forest products into meat, milk, and eggs for human consumption. The key to making this system work was timing and rotation. The peasants didn't just release their animals at random, they understood the seasons and the cycles of the forest. For example, pigs were released in autumn to feast on fallen nuts, while goats did their best work in spring when new growth appeared. This careful rotation prevented overgrazing and allowed the forest to regenerate. But the forest wasn't the only place where medieval peasants found free food for their animals. When the animals returned from their woodland feast, they'd find that the peasants had even more free food waiting for them back at the farm. The medieval household was a treasure trove of waste not, want not thinking. While the forest provided one source of animal feed, the kitchen table offered another. Every medieval home kept what we would now call a slop bucket. But for the peasants, this wasn't just a trash can, it was more like a savings account. These wooden pails or clay pots placed near the cooking area collected all sorts of scraps, from vegetable peelings to leftover breadcrumbs. One record from a 14th century English kitchen shows that the kitchen saved an impressive 400 pounds of food scraps each year. That's enough to feed nearly 15% of their pig's diet without spending a penny. If medieval financial advisors had existed, they surely would have called this the scraps to bacon investment strategy. There was a clear hierarchy in how the food scraps were distributed. Humans ate the best bits of the food, while chickens got the smaller scraps, breadcrumbs, grain bits, and tiny food fragments. Pigs got the bulk of the leftovers because their omnivorous appetites could handle nearly anything. These pigs were essentially furry garbage disposals, but with the bonus of turning waste into bacon. Winter presented special challenges for storing scraps to prevent them from freezing, so many households kept their slop buckets near the hearth, where the residual warmth kept the contents from freezing. This also encouraged fermentation, which pigs actually preferred. Their taste buds found slightly sour food more appealing. So medieval pigs were basically the original sourdough aficionados. But the slop bucket wasn't the only recycling system in the medieval household. Dairy waste became a premium animal feed. When milk soured or butter went rancid, it was fed straight to the animals. Whey, a byproduct of cheese making, was particularly valuable. Medieval farming manuals from the 1400s recommended feeding whey to growing piglets to help them develop strong bones. This was an early example of medieval recycling at its finest. The whey protein shakes just happened to come with a side of winks. Nothing edible was wasted in the medieval home. Even bones from the table were repurposed. After the human family had finished with them, the bones were given to the dogs to gnaw on. Any remaining fragments then joined the pig slop, providing calcium and minerals. Medieval households had a bone recycling program that would make today's zero-waste advocates proud. And when there were holiday feasts or special meals, the animals got in on the action too. The leftovers from human feasts, organs, fat, and scraps, became a special treat for the animals, helping them fatten up for the winter months. Feeding animals wasn't just about scraps, though. The medieval peasants were experts at creating food for their livestock from all sorts of unexpected sources. For example, leftover porridge that had stuck to the pot would be soaked in water overnight and used to feed the chickens. Bread that had gone stale and hard found new life when soaked in water or cooking juices. If medieval chickens could talk, they'd probably ask for yesterday's porridge pot soaked overnight with stale breadcrumbs for breakfast. The peasants also knew their animals' preferences. Chickens eagerly devoured crushed eggshells for calcium. Pigs liked their food slightly fermented, and goats enjoyed picking through mixed slop for the most fibrous bits. These peasants were the original food critics, carefully observing which slop combinations got the highest ratings from their furry or feathered reviewers.
The medieval slop feeding system wasn't just about tossing food to the animals, it was an art form. Families often kept separate buckets for different types of waste, knowing that what pleased a pig might not necessarily satisfy a chicken. Special wooden troughs were carved with dividers to prevent food competition, ensuring that even the smallest or weakest animals got their fair share of the table's bounty. This attention to detail meant that animals were not just well-fed, they were thriving. Once the animals had finished scouring the household leftovers, many would wander out to the fields, where another bounty of free food awaited them. After harvest, fields transformed into open-air buffets where animals feasted on the leftovers. This practice, called gleaning, wasn't just for the poor. Animals took part in it too. After the human harvesters had gathered the crops, farmers would open the gates and let animals in to pick up the scraps. First came the geese, who would munch on fallen grain and seeds. Next, sheep and cows would move through, nibbling on the taller stalks and leaves. Finally, the pigs would come in, rooting up any remaining tubers or roots. This system of sequential grazing allowed the animals to recover up to 20% of a field's total biomass as animal feed, instead of letting it go to waste. Fields of cabbage provided particularly rich pickings. Medieval varieties of cabbage were massive. Some heads weighed up to 40 pounds. Farmers harvested the central head for humans, but left the outer leaves attached to the stems. These leftover leaves became an all-you-can-eat salad bar for the livestock. The cows didn't even complain about the lack of ranch dressing. Peasants knew how to plan their harvests with their animals in mind. For example, when they pulled root vegetables like turnips or carrots from the ground, they would cut off the tops and leave them behind, creating a free buffet for their animals. By the end of the day, these heaps of nutrient-rich greens would be waiting for the animals to devour. A single acre of root crops could produce up to a ton of leafy tops, free animal feed that required no effort beyond the initial harvest. Threshing grain also created a feeding opportunity. The process of separating the grain from the stalks produced chaff, the papery husks and bits that were unsuitable for human consumption. Mixed with a little water, chaff became a fiber-rich feed that helped the animals through the winter months. Unlike modern animals who might turn up their noses at chaff, medieval animals didn't mind it at all. They knew a free meal when they saw one. Field edges and borders also became valuable growing spots. Peasants would plant fast-growing crops like turnips along the field margins specifically for animal consumption. These crops were never harvested by humans. Animals were simply allowed to graze on them directly. This practice, called catch cropping, helped maximize land use by growing animal feed in spaces that were too small for main crops. Bean plants were another dual-purpose crop. Humans harvested the beans, but animals ate the nitrogen-rich vines and leaves. Some medieval tax records even valued bean straw at half the price of hay, an impressive amount for something that was considered waste. Timing was everything when it came to letting animals feast on these leftovers. One medieval farming manual advised, send the geese first to eat seeds, then the sheep for the top leaves, then the cows for stems, and finally the pigs to root up what remains. This sequence ensured that each animal got what it could best digest, helping to maximize the feed value of the leftover crops. Fruit orchards were another prime source of free food for the animals. After the human harvest, animals were allowed to clean up fallen and bruised fruit. Pigs in particular thrived on windfall apples and pears, which are rich in natural sugars that help fatten them up before winter. In some medieval communities, specific pig days were designated when individual families could bring their pigs to feast under the fruit trees. Even if crop failures occurred, animals still had a chance to benefit. If a grain field suffered from weather or pests to the point where the human harvest wasn't worthwhile, the entire crop would be turned over to the animals. This allowed the peasants to salvage the situation and ensure the animals were fed. Even weeds, which might seem like a nuisance to modern farmers, became valuable feed resources. Thistles, nettles, and dock plants, typically pulled from fields to protect crops, were gathered into piles and fed to goats, who happily munched them down. Medieval goats were essentially natural weed whackers, turning garden annoyances into milk and meat. While plants were a significant source of food for medieval animals, they weren't the only game in town. Medieval chickens and ducks, for instance, didn't rely on store-bought pellets full of protein. Instead, they hunted their own high-protein snacks all day long. These backyard birds were expert insect exterminators, gobbling up beetles, worms, snails, grubs, and spiders with impressive enthusiasm. Watching chickens hunt bugs was like seeing tiny feathered velociraptors in action, scratching, pecking, and darting around with surprising speed and focus. In fact, records from medieval households show that a flock of just 10 chickens could clear 5 to 7 pounds of insects and grubs from a garden area each week during the summer months. This free pest control not only kept the garden in check, but it also produced eggs as a bonus. These chickens were the original organic pest management system, except they paid their rent with breakfast. Medieval peasants weren't passive about this insect hunting. They actively helped their birds find protein-rich treats. On warm days, they would use sticks to stir compost piles and manure heaps, exposing fat worms and even maggots that came writhing to the surface. The chickens knew exactly what to do when the disturbance occurred and would rush in for the feast. Wet weather provided even more opportunities for free protein. After rainstorms, slugs and snails emerged in greater numbers, and peasants, often children, would gather them by hand and toss them directly into poultry pens. One 15th century household account even mentions a child collecting over 200 snails after a heavy rain, an unexpected protein bonanza for the family's ducks. Medieval kids weren't glued to video games after rainstorms. They were on a slug safari, hunting the world's slowest game. Some of the more resourceful peasants even created insect-friendly environments near their chicken coops. They would leave small piles of hay, straw, or leaves in slightly damp areas, allowing these piles to become insect breeding grounds. Once the bugs had colonized the piles, the peasants would shake them out into the chicken yard, creating an insect shower that sent the birds into a feeding frenzy. Old, rotting logs were treated as valuable chicken feed resources. Villagers would drag fallen logs near the chicken yards and let them rot for months. Periodically, they would roll the logs over to expose the insects living underneath. One farming text even recommended having at least 3 good rotting logs for every dozen hens. It was the medieval equivalent of protein supplement containers, and it required minimal effort beyond a sharp eye for insect habitats and an occasional poke with a stick. The bug hunting approach was incredibly low maintenance, but highly effective. Chickens got high-quality protein that improved their egg production and health, while villages and farms benefited from natural pest control, reducing the number of disease-carrying insects and crop-damaging pests. These medieval peasants understood the nutritional value of insects long before modern science confirmed it. They noticed that chickens with access to plenty of bugs laid eggs with brighter, more orange yolks, thanks to the carotenoids and other nutrients found in insects. They also observed that bug-hunting chickens were more disease-resistant and productive compared to those without access to insects. During particularly productive insect seasons, some households would even collect extra beetles, grasshoppers, and other large bugs, dry them in the sun, and store them in clay pots for winter feeding. It was an early form of protein preservation that ensured that some insect nutrition would still be available in colder months.
As the cold months approached, the real challenge for medieval farmers began. Winter was hard on both the humans and their animals. While today we can rely on store-bought feeds and the convenience of online orders, medieval peasants had to rely on their resourcefulness and ingenuity to ensure their animals were well fed throughout the long, harsh winter. This required not just a careful management of the crops, but an intimate knowledge of how to preserve feed for the lean months ahead. One of the most important skills in a medieval livestock keeper's toolkit was haymaking. Hay wasn't just a simple crop to be harvested. It was an art form with strict timing. The peasants didn't simply cut any grass. They waited for the perfect moment, when the meadow plants had reached full growth but hadn't yet gone to seed. This timing was essential because it maximized both the volume and the nutritional content of the hay. Folk wisdom, recorded in a 14th century farming almanac, advised, "Cut when the dew has dried, but before the sun has baked out the goodness." This careful attention to timing meant that hay cut at just the right moment could have up to 20% more protein than hay harvested too early or too late. Once the hay was cut, the challenge was to store it properly. Medieval hay storage was an intricate process, somewhat akin to a game of agricultural Tetris. Farmers had to figure out how to stack hay in barns and lofts without it all coming crashing down. Not having enough land for dedicated hay fields didn't stop peasants. They were masters of making the most of what they had,
gathering dried stalks from roadsides, forest clearings, and other areas where plants grew tall. These weren't just random grasses, though. Medieval herders had an extensive knowledge of plant species and could identify which ones provided the best nutrition for their animals. In one English village, records show that a single peasant family might gather hay from as many as 15 different locations to feed their animals during the winter months. Leaf fodder became another crucial winter feed source. During the summer and early autumn, peasants would collect leafy branches from trees like elm, ash, and linden. These branches were bundled while still green and hung to dry in attics or outbuildings. By the time winter arrived, these bundles of dried leaves, known as tree hay in some regions, would provide nutritious food for goats and sheep. Goats in particular loved to strip the dried leaves and sometimes even nibbled on the smallest twigs. Vegetable preservation also played a major role in feeding animals through the winter. After the cabbage heads were harvested for human food, the stalks were not discarded. Instead, they were strung up in bundles and allowed to dry. These dried cabbage stalks, though too tough for human consumption, were perfectly digestible for cattle when rehydrated in warm water. In many households, dozens of these stalks would be hung from barn rafters, creating what appeared to be bizarre vegetable decorations, but were in fact crucial winter survival food. Root cellars, which provided cool, damp storage for root vegetables like turnips and beets, served both human and animal needs. As these vegetables began to sprout or soften, making them less desirable for people, they were redirected to feed the animals. One recorded practice involved grating old turnips into water, creating a nutritious slurry that could be fed to pigs and chickens. It might not sound glamorous, but when the alternative is freezing or starvation, grated turnips were a godsend for both humans and animals alike. Even the byproducts of grain threshing were repurposed for animal feed. After separating the grain from the stalks, the remaining chaff, the papery husks and bits that were unsuitable for human use, was mixed with water to create a fiber-rich feed that helped animals through the winter. Some peasants even fermented the chaff in wooden tubs, creating a primitive form of silage that was particularly appealing to livestock during the colder months. Medieval peasants also had a keen sense of how to make use of their grain byproducts. Crushed eggshells, which were often saved throughout the year, were dried by the hearth and stored in clay pots for later use. Come winter, these crushed shells were mixed into chicken feed to provide the calcium necessary for egg production. Medieval chickens didn't get fancy calcium supplements, they got recycled eggshells. This sustainable approach ensured that chickens could keep producing eggs during the darkest months, long before modern farming practices introduced commercial supplements. The knowledge of which feeds to give to which animals and when to feed them was passed down through generations. Medieval households followed detailed feeding schedules to ensure that scarce winter resources were allocated wisely. Some communities even maintained records of winter feed consumption, helping them refine their storage plans for the following year. The careful planning and strategic use of resources meant that animals could survive through the winter without requiring peasants to purchase expensive grain or hay. The most impressive aspect of medieval animal care was the peasants' understanding of animal nutritional needs. They didn't have modern science to rely on, but they observed that animals fed with the right foods were healthier and more productive. For example, they noticed that pregnant eves fed dried clover leaves had stronger lambs. Cows fed fermented chaff produced richer milk, and horses working in snow needed more stored hay to keep their energy up. This careful attention to detail and the ability to read the signs of nature allowed peasants to manage their animals with remarkable success, ensuring that the livestock could survive even the harshest winters. This resourceful approach to animal feeding, using foraged food, stored scraps, and carefully planned feed schedules, allowed medieval peasants to keep their animals well fed without relying on expensive and often unavailable grain or commercial feed. It was a system based on sustainability, knowledge, and timing, with a deep understanding of the land and its cycles. By utilizing the bounty of nature, whether in the form of forest forage, household waste, agricultural byproducts, or even insects, the medieval peasants created a feeding system that not only supported their animals, but also helped them thrive. This system of getting something for nothing provided the foundation for animal husbandry in a time when resources were scarce and the challenges were great. The ingenuity and resourcefulness of these medieval farmers were truly ahead of their time, and they managed to make the most of what they had, ensuring that their animals stayed healthy and productive, even through the coldest, leanest months of the year. In the end, the story of how medieval peasants fed their animals is a testament to the power of sustainable farming practices and resourceful thinking. It's a reminder that sometimes the best solutions are the ones that work with nature instead of against it. The peasants didn't have fancy technology or modern machinery. They simply knew how to read the land, how to work with it, and how to make the most of what was available to them. And in doing so, they not only survived, but thrived.